One of the ways journalists can slant coverage of an issue is to ignore it. If people don't know an issue exists, well, then probably nothing will be done about it. But the opposite is also true. If journalists give a lot of real estate to an issue, but that coverage is overly positive or negative, then you might get a distorted view of the issue. And it's also possible to do both at the same time. Welcome to Newspeak, I'm Holly Kellum. So in the New York Times recently, I saw two articles, both published on the same day by two of the same reporters. One takes an unsparing view of the traditional Chinese dance company Shen Yun, and the other about how Falun Gong has grown into a global movement. Now, the connection here, if you don't know, is that Shen Yun Performing Arts was founded by Falun Gong practitioners. Falun Gong, also known as Falun Dafa, is a meditation and Qigong practice that was introduced to the public in China in 1992. It has since spread around the world, and one of the reasons it spread so quickly is because so many Falun Gong practitioners have had to leave China. Since 1999, the Chinese Communist Party has been trying to eradicate the practice. You see, the leader of the CCP at the time, Jiang Zemin, saw tens of millions of people taking up the practice, even more than were in the Communist Party at the time. Despite the government initially promoting the practice's health benefits and moral teachings, the party can't tolerate anything that it can't control. Now, depending which media you follow, you might not realize that Falun Gong is one of the most persecuted groups in China today. After a 2-year propaganda blitz in which the Chinese Communist Party turned generally positive public opinion against Falun Gong, its media went silent. The CCP simply pretended that Falun Gong didn't exist, while at the same time detaining hundreds of thousands of Falun Gong practitioners, expelling their children from schools, forcing them out of their jobs, and many more egregious crimes. Probably one of the most horrific is the party's use of Falun Gong as a live organ bank. It uses Falun Gong practitioners, who are generally pretty healthy, as a ready supply of organs for its massive medical tourism industry. That, plus other prisoners, allows a patient in China to get an organ in a matter of days or weeks, as opposed to months or years in other countries like here in the US. There was pretty widespread coverage of the issue in 2019 when an independent tribunal in the UK concluded that Falun Gong practitioners had been one and probably the main source of organ supply. Now, while this conclusion, like I said, received widespread coverage in the media internationally, there was one media company that was notably silent. That was the New York Times. The Times not only didn't cover the tribunal's findings, but one of its reporters submitted testimony to the tribunal claiming that the Times had killed her investigation into the issue. She described attending an off-the-record dinner with two doctors in China in 2016. One doctor was upset that her articles about China's use of prisoner organs was making it difficult for him to get his work recognized internationally. The other doctor asked what was wrong with using prisoners for their organs, and he specifically asked about prisoners of conscience, which are people in prison for their beliefs or political views. Now, that was pretty clear confirmation that one, not only was China using prisoners of conscience for their organs, which the government had previously denied, but that it also hadn't stopped killing prisoners for their organs as the government had claimed a few years earlier. She said she got the impression the New York Times was not pleased that I was pursuing these stories, and after initially tolerating my efforts, made it impossible for me to continue. Editors appeared to believe the organ donation issue in China had been solved by the state's admission that they had used prisoner organs and its promise of December 14th that they no longer were doing so. Now, whether they really believed that or wanted to believe that are two different things. I find it hard to believe that senior editors at the Times had no skepticism of the government's new policy, especially after the exchange that Tatlow described between the two doctors. Now, since Tatlow left the Times in 2017, I haven't been able to find any New York Times articles on the subject since then. Now, here's my speculation as to what happened. Falun Gong is a third rail issue for the Chinese Communist Party, meaning anyone who raises the issue of forced organ harvesting or the persecution of Falun Gong immediately becomes a target of the Chinese government. And the New York Times has already had its reporters kicked out for reporting on less sensitive topics. In March of 2020, shortly after the pandemic hit, China expelled almost all of the New York Times reporters. According to the Times, while the Chinese government's official statement cited diplomatic tension as the reason for the expulsion, state media outlets pointed to our critical reporting of China's mass detention of Muslims, government surveillance, and its response to the coronavirus outbreak in Wuhan as reasons for the move. Now, the reason Falun Gong is so sensitive is because not only has the party not been able to stamp it out after 25 years, but Falun Gong practitioners have been probably the most successful at shining a spotlight on the party's crimes. Shen Yun is a good example of that. In addition to its traditional dance and music numbers, it has dances depicting the persecution of Falun Gong and even the CCP's forced organ harvesting. Because of that, wherever Shen Yun goes, the Chinese government tries to shut it down. Its embassies and consulates write threatening letters to the theaters, Shen Yun's bus tires have been slashed, and according to one of its MCs, has even received bomb threats. The non-profit Falun Dafa Information Center says internal party documents it obtained revealed that instructions to sabotage Shen Yun come from the very top of the CCP. Central authorities have issued directives that deem suppressing Shen Yun to be an important part of the struggle against Falun Gong. Now, going back to the Times' motive, maybe, like I said, the Times is just trying to keep its reporters in China. The Times' Shanghai bureau chief says in her bio she's still in Hong Kong because she's waiting for a visa to travel to Shanghai. That's despite the Biden administration easing restrictions on Chinese state media in the US in order to get American journalists back into China. But the other motive here could be profit. China is the second largest country by population in the world, and because of that, Mandarin is one of the most widely spoken languages. You may have noticed the Chinese characters at the top of many Times articles in recent years. If you click on them, it allows you to translate the article into Mandarin. Now, it's not a secret that media companies writ large are struggling for cash, and despite increasing its digital sales last year, the Times ad revenue declined. And it doesn't take a business whiz to know that one way to future-proof your business is to expand into new markets. With China having the second largest population in the world, it's a temptation that many companies have fallen for. Levi Browdy, the executive director of the Falun Dafa Information Center, said one way business people can ingratiate themselves to the CCP is to disparage Falun Gong.
They understand that if they're going to do business in China, to some extent, particularly with the third rail issues like Falun Gong, they have to toe the line. And so you see that, unfortunately, across industries.
Now, if that's the case, it would explain the tone of the articles, especially the one about Shen Yun. Now, sometimes if you choose to focus on a problem as your angle for a story, it can give the impression you're trying to paint whatever you're reporting on in a negative light, even if the goal is just to explore that one problem. But to me, the difference between having an angle and bias is whether you're willing to include evidence that goes against your narrative. The New York Times angle on this piece was specifically looking at the injuries Shen Yun dancers, all of them former, had sustained over almost 20 years the company has been around. It says it interviewed 25 former dancers, musicians, and instructors, all but one of whom gave a negative impression of their time with Shen Yun, or I should say, at least the parts quoted in the articles were negative. Now, like I said, Shen Yun has been around for almost 20 years. The Falun Dafa Information Center says there are over 1,000 current and former Shen Yun dancers. So to find 25 people who had injuries or a bad experience, I don't think would be hard. But the question to me is, were the reporters on this story, as one reporter claims in her bio, following the facts wherever they lead? Here's why I think they weren't. The Times journalist said that the representatives of Shen Yun and Falun Gong declined to make Mr. Li and other Shen Yun leaders available for interviews. Now, that's partially true. Browdy confirmed that while he provided written responses to their questions, he had declined an in-person interview.
It was abundantly clear to us that they were going after a very negative article. So, for example, of all the former artists that we know of, they were only contacting the ones that they think had a very specific negative story. So we realized at that point, this is clearly, they have an agenda here. We don't want to participate that. So after finding out all that, we said, no thanks, we're not going to give you an interview.
However, he said Shen Yun did make an offer to have the reporters interview current performers, something the Times article doesn't mention.
They had refused, right before they published these articles, they had refused some interviews we offered them that would have countered some of the primary narratives they were trying to put out.
Browdy says this is in keeping with the New York Times coverage of Falun Gong pretty much from the beginning of the persecution.
From the beginning, the New York Times was riddled with inaccuracies. It was towing the party line with the CCP and using its talking points in describing Falun Gong, and it led the way in the silence of the persecution, just going years and years and years, completely ignoring gross human rights abuses in China.
Shen Yun also pushed back on the New York Times piece, saying in a statement, "These twisted portrayals of the company veer far from reality and grossly distort Shen Yun's workplace culture, the quality of life of our artists, as well as the teachings and belief of our Falun Gong faith." Several Shen Yun dancers who have YouTube channels have also said the Times coverage doesn't represent their experience at Shen Yun.
It's just completely the opposite of our experience at Shen Yun.
Now, going back to the New York Times piece on Falun Gong, it was pretty remarkable how it parroted some of Beijing's talking points. For one, when it describes the persecution, it merely says that many Falun Gong practitioners died in police custody. That's like saying many died under Pol Pot. Yes, that is true, but using the term many to describe over 1.7 million people who died under the Khmer Rouge government doesn't quite give the full story. The Falun Dafa Information Center says it's been able to verify at least 5,000 deaths, but that number is likely a gross undercount because of how hard it is to get good data out of China. It says estimates from multiple separate independent reports indicate hundreds of thousands of Falun Gong practitioners may have been killed in order to extract their vital organs. Now, I have to say, as someone who majored in peace studies in college and has devoted my life to journalism since then, it's especially painful to see such an influential media company, especially one that is so well recognized around the world, falling for the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda, or worse, aiding and abetting its crimes. But I hope the New York Times reporters watch this and have the journalistic instincts to correct their mistakes. I've reached out to the two main reporters on these stories with the points I outlined here, and if I get a response from them, I'll put it as a pinned comment below. Once again, I'm Kellum, and you're watching Newspeak.